Scott Nicholson is here from Syracuse University. I can just read off the slide for the introduction. Yeah, excellent. And if you do a Google search on him, you'll find that there's a horror author that he claims not to be, which is fine, but there's also some fascinating photos, of which some of them I'm trying to figure out how he's connected with them, because there's a story there, if in fact he is. Scott's here to talk about meaningful gamification, and I think this is a really good talk, because for people who are in game studies, will recognize, game studies from the humanities basic perspective, will recognize meaningful gamification is often considered a contradiction in terms. And we want to see how this plays out in this talk. By all means, go to Because Play Matters, which is the lab you run. And also there's an interesting list of Scott's games that he's developed. And to see how some of this can work, you have one called the Library Adventure ARG Toolkit. And it struck me that what a great topic for an ARG, an alternate reality game, because we all know that libraries are designed to draw you in a medieval style, keep you there, and not let you out. And then cause all kinds of physiological problems as you're inside. So it's a really interesting project from that standpoint. So thank you very much for being here. And really looking forward to this talk. We're doing a fair bit of work in gamification in the Games Institute. Oh, by the way, the GI pun has already been used by a group we have called the Games Institute Janes, or GI Janes, a project that's devoted to provide much more comfortable online spaces, or even physical spaces, for women who are involved in games, because I don't know if you know this, but the internet isn't a nice place. And it can get really awful there. So I just thought I'd let you know that we have played off the GI pun already. So thank you very much for being here, Scott. I really look forward to this talk.
All right, thank you. So thank you all for coming and providing some nice weather for me. I'm up here from Syracuse, so my weather's following. It's coming tomorrow. Yeah, that's about what we do. But so yeah, I'm from Syracuse University. I run the Because Play Matters Game Lab, and my own gaming passion, actually most of my life, I've been involved in tabletop games and games beyond screens. And in fact, this was my first game design. I was one of the authors of Call of Cthulhu live-action role-playing game. Yes, not only am I a LARPer, I designed a LARP system. Those of you that are gamers understand what I have just admitted to. But funny enough, this stuff I did when I was in college still holds true today, because I do a lot of work with libraries, museums, battlegrounds, spaces. I really like place-based games. And a lot of what I did with LARPing, I still use, because I'm looking to get people out into a place. Rather than focusing on the engagement between people and a screen, I want to focus on the engagement between people, and between people and a place. That's a lot of what I create. I've also been a board game designer. I brought a couple of them to pass around. So this is my first board game, Tulipmania 1637. This came out in 2009. It was a game about a bubble stock market. So as players, you were the evil manipulators creating a bubble market, trying to get out before it crashed. I got inspired to do this when I was in Amsterdam at the Tulip Museum on the bottom floor. They have a whole exhibit on Tulipmania. And I said, you know, there's not a stock market game that's about bubble markets. So I made this game. The publisher actually went bankrupt, ironically enough, before I got my first royalty check. So that didn't work out so well. But so this game was kind of a hardcore economic game. And I do a lot of work with libraries. Actually, I'll pass this book around. Everyone plays with the library. I've been working with games and libraries for a while. I did a MOOC in 2010, before the term MOOC existed. It's a class on games and libraries, and it's actually open, unlike most MOOCs. It's still on YouTube. It's still freely available, but it turned into this book. But the stuff I did with libraries then, they wanted this. They said, "Oh, Scott, you made a game. Let's have your game." Like, no, this is hardcore economic game. This is not good. So I made this game, Going, Going, Gone. This game just came out 3 months ago. Was published by Stronghold Press, available in your friendly local game store, because I was there yesterday at J&J's and they had it there. I always, whenever I'm in the area, that is a fantastic store. I picked up the last copy of Caverna, was very happy about that, but was happy to see 3 copies of my game on the shelf there. I'm like, hey, I did that. So that was cool. And actually, other cool thing, this I'm really excited about. Games Magazine this game is reviewed this month in Games Magazine. So I just bought it on the way up here. I'm so excited. This is important to me because as a kid, when I grew up in rural Oklahoma on a horse farm in the 1980s. So Games Magazine was my portal to the world of any other interesting games. And I remember I'd get it each year, I'd read each article, and then the Games 100 would come up, and they'd always have this contest. Who remembers the contest in the Games 100? The pieces, they put pieces from a bunch of games on the cover. If you could list all the games that were represented, you could win 100 games. I thought that was awesome as a kid. I'll talk about why it's not so awesome in a few slides. But Going, Gone, it's an auction game. The game was designed to be a play in public game, to be a loud, noisy game that you could watch, and you would understand how it was being played from just watching it. The rules fit on either side of that auction paddle. Because what I do is I do these public game events, and I'd bring out Euro games, and people would watch the Euro games being played, and everyone looked like they were in a lot of pain. And I said, well, I want a game that looks fun and is noisy. So this game I made for libraries. It's raucous. You carry out 5 auctions simultaneously in 10 seconds. Cool. So my goal was to create an auction game that was more like the real world, rather than the most boring auction games where you sit and count numbers. But I'm not talking about that stuff today. A little bit other things that I've done. I created the first web-based video series about board games. So from 2005 to 2010, I did Board Games with Scott. And this is where I got to find out what it was like to win 100 games, because every publisher was sending me every game they made, which is not really awesome. Because despite the song title, everything is not awesome. You get a lot of board games that are not very good and a lot of expectations to actually cover the things. But I did this for 5 years. You can still find all those videos online. And then I started the podcast on board games with a couple other folks, and I still am occasionally involved with that podcasting side of things. This is kind of the high point of my board game space. This is Mo Rocca. So he came to Syracuse and actually did an interview with me about board games that appeared on CBS early morning, where I learned that 4 hours of videotaping becomes 2 minutes of little snippets said about you, where I got to tell the entire world that the game I hate the most is Monopoly. That generated a lot of discussion. But anyway, academically, I made the Library Game Lab in 2007 and started to study how libraries looked at games, and really got to understand how games come into play with communities, how they use games to build communities. But I needed to shift that. So for a year, I went off to MIT, which I kind of say is like going to Hogwarts. Lots of magical stuff happens, and you're not really sure what's going to happen next. I was a visiting professor of comparative media studies. I worked with the Gambit Game Lab, which is now the MIT Game Lab. I lived in the dorms, which is really interesting for a 40-year-old to live in the dorms. But more importantly, one thing I did there was I ran a family game jam at the MIT Science Museum, where I brought together families, and they worked as a family unit to make a game. And watching that process really inspired me to move into what I've done now. It's created this Because Play Matters Lab, where I focus on creating transformative games for informal learning spaces. So I work a lot with libraries, with museums, those sort of things. The other thing I did, and I won't talk about this in this talk, but you can learn a lot about it online, is I created a community group called the Game Designers Guild. This is a group where we meet once a month on a Friday night. It's open to students, to anyone. We've got kids, teens, adults, gamers, all coming together. And each month, someone from the community who needs a game comes and pitches their need. And we work with them to create a prototype and create a game. And this has led to a lot of these games we've been doing. It led to running a live-action role-playing game for kindergartners about dinosaurs at the local library. It led to doing a game jam for disadvantaged teens in a science museum. It's led to some really cool stuff. And what I'm working on right now is a Game Designers Guild Hall that will enable any of you that want to start a Game Designers Guild to do so. But today here I'm going to talk about my research path, and that's gamification. I've been looking at gamification for a couple years, and I'll give you a path of how I got there. So first, a broad definition of what gamification is, if you haven't heard the term. I'll talk about reward-based gamification, and then I'll move into talking about meaningful gamification. So this is my own gamification definition. I've used a lot of the ones that are heavily cited, but I've found over the years that there's some gaps in them, and so I'm working on a book now called The Gamification Journey, and I needed more in that definition. So this is the definition I'm working with. That gamification is the application, so it's applying something, of gameful or playful layers to motivate involvement, this is the key word here, motivation, in a specific context. Gamification is a motivation tool. In fact, my class on gamification has morphed over the years, and the current title for that class is called Motivation Through Games and Play. Because I've realized at its heart, gamification is about motivation, and I'll talk about that. Now, what's a game? A lot of definitions. We could spend a long time on what a game is. This definition is one we'll come back to a little bit later. There's 3 things that make up a game that we're going to look at. That's play, goals, and structure. So a game is a form of play with goals and structure. Very simple definition. We can add a lot more to it. Since this is a place where game studies goes on, we could spend hours debating this one, but we won't. So most gamification is about adding goals. That's the idea. And in fact, I noted that Neil did something that I use as a typical gamification example. He stood up from his chair, he took a piece of paper, he wadded it up, he threw it towards the trash can in the back, and then he popped his hands in the air. He just gamified throwing something away. He added a game layer himself to the real world, and you all do that. You make things out of games. You know, your game might be, hey, can I get through that light while it's still yellow? You know, that's a game we play very often. Or the game of, is the pedestrian actually going to start in the crosswalk? I played that one with your students as I was trying to drive up here, and it's like, your eyeball, it's like, are you going? No, yeah, it's like, oh. But a game, another definition of the game is Bernard Suit's definition. It's the idea that we're taking on unnecessary obstacles, that we're engaging in games because we want to take on a challenge, we want to take on something. And you need some kind of structure to facilitate that. So even with the small gamification of the trash can, you have a structure. My structure is I'm going to stand up from where I am, I'm not going to move, I'm going to wad the paper, I'm going to throw it, I get one shot to make it. And you've added these little layers. And a lot of gamification, though, comes down to adding this stuff, rewards. Much of gamification is about adding rewards. It's about giving people some sort of virtual rewards to entice them to engage in something in the real world. Now, we've actually had this system around for a while. There's a universal system of these sorts of points that we're used to handing out, and you do things and you get these points and then you can get benefits for these points, and we call it money. You know, we've had these sort of rewards going on for a long time. It's something that we have. We don't need a new system for it. So this reward-based gamification, the basic idea is you take something in the real world, you add a game-like goal to it, so something that's game-ish, gamey, you develop a structure to support that goal, and then you add some sort of reward. We've seen this a lot of times. I'm just going to give you a few examples. So these incentive systems that came out of the airlines, it came out of hotels, this idea that we're adding this layer of points and rewards to incentivize you to continue to use our airlines. They work. They get you to continue to use the airlines. As long as they're willing to keep handing out those miles, you know, you're going to continue flying with those particular airlines. You probably have a wallet that looks like this. All of these game-like systems that you have chosen to engage in, where you're getting these basic levels of points and exchanging them for rewards. This is something that we engage with regularly, so it's something we're very comfortable with doing. But even Monopoly, this is actually the Monopoly, the McDonald's Monopoly game is their biggest promotion. It's their most popular promotion. It's a basic set collection game. Eat at McDonald's, you know, get lots of healthy food in you, and collect sets of stuff and get rewards. So they've gamified eating this food. But this is also a form of gamification we've had for some time. You know, the military figured out a long time ago, a lot of talk about badges. You know, how wonderful badges are, and badges can get people to engage in different activities, and the military's known this for some time. You know, Napoleon, he figured it out. You know, he figured out that just a little piece of colored ribbon will get a soldier to do a lot of different things. So we've had gamification for a while, and that's the first message I want to get across to you. It's just because we have this name for gamification, the reality is these incentive-based and reward-based systems is something we've had for a while, and we know how they work, and we know why they are problematic. This is probably the biggest problem we have with education. Those of you that teach know that it's very difficult to get students to do something that aren't affiliated with a badge. And just because we're changing the name of the badges, just because we're saying we're going to make more specific badges, doesn't mean it's going to change the impact they have. Rather than students saying, well, I get a grade for this, it's going to be students saying, well, I get a badge for this. And if there's not a badge for that thing, well, the student's not going to do it. If you think about kids before they go to school, they're interested in learning. They're excited to learn. But then they get into this system where they're given grades for everything. And that interest in learning for the sake of learning goes down. I'll talk a little bit about that later. I've called this gamification BLAP gamification. BLAP for the acronym of badges, levels and leaderboards, achievements, and points. I also call it BLAP because what you can do is if you want to use BLAP gamification, it's very easy. Just look around you, find a system, any system you want to motivate people to do, take your system of rewards, points, and badges, drop it on there, it lands with a BLAP. And all of a sudden, you have motivation. Hooray! That's what we see today with a lot of gamification. You start with points. How do I want to control you? I want to control you by giving you points for stuff. That's the core idea, which actually, as game designers, we've been doing for a long time. As a game designer, you motivate your player to do stuff in a game by giving them points. You used to also motivate people by giving them lives. So you might have points and lives, and the game was risk versus reward. Do I risk losing a life in order to achieve those points? Now we've gotten away from lives. We've replaced lives with time. That most games today, you can take as long as you want to get past some aspect of the game. So if you think about it, in a fairly creepy way, we've actually exchanged virtual lives for your real life. That we are, as game designers, we are convincing you to spend more and more time of your real life trying to achieve our points and goals. Ugh. Anyway, so with gamification, you're taking something in the real world, you're offering people points to do it. You can help them have progress in a system by offering them levels. So they give a leveling system to help them contextualize 62,375,000,000 points into level 27. It makes it easier for them to understand where they are progressing in the system. Or you can have leaderboards and/or leaderboards. Leaderboards allow you to see competition with each other. Later on, I'll talk a little bit about how I've applied this stuff in class, and I learned a really important lesson. Adding leaderboards to a class can be a very, very bad idea. Because leaderboards are basically, I'm here, I hate those people, and those people hate me. And the problem is, when you get too low on the leaderboard, you become very demotivated. And that's what happened in my class. I actually mapped out, week by week, what happened with the leaderboards. And 3 students got very motivated and very competitive and were at the top. A body, about half the students, went for a few weeks and then they flatlined. And the rest of the students sat there at the bottom. Because once they got off to a bad start, they saw no reason to try. And it happened week after week after week. This split happened between so leaderboards did a good job of motivating a few of the students, but it left a lot of the students behind. So it's a very dangerous thing to use in classes. Achievements are when you're encouraging people to explore something outside of the point system. And this is actually, achievements actually have the potential to be pretty meaningful. They can be interesting. Unless you're using achievements like, yay, you finished the tutorial system, here's an achievement. That's not a very motivating way to use achievements. But you can use these achievements to get people to explore something in a different way, and we'll come back to that a little later. And then badges, badges, badges. I just returned from the Digital Media and Learning Conference, which one of the big sponsors is Mozilla with the Open Badges movement. And I heard the term badges a bajillion times. In fact, I felt a little bad because I gave a talk, an Ignite talk, in the closing session called Beyond Badges, talking about the problems with badges. And then the next 4 people on the docket were all presenting their wonderful badge systems. So anyway, I felt a little bad about that. What I really felt bad about, and I shouldn't say bad, but vindicated by, was the person who got up and said, the reason why badges are so great for teachers is because you don't have to write those letters of references 5 years later. That takes so much time. You can just have the students have badges. Really? So I'm a little concerned where this badges, this reward system may end up. But I was reading, when I was at MIT, I was learning about gamification. And I was reading this book, the O'Reilly textbook on gamification by Zuckerman. And I hit this quote, and it stopped me dead in my tracks. Once you start giving someone a reward, you have to keep her in that reward loop forever. I said, oh crap. I've got to tell the libraries about this. Because I was starting to see more and more interest in libraries in using gamification systems. Using these systems to get people engaged without any awareness that they are actually getting themselves into real trouble. That there's some problems here. And I wanted to say, well, why? What's going on? This led me down the rabbit hole, the journey I'm going to take you on now. I began to explore this book. And this book I would point to as, this was a life-changing book for me. If you haven't seen this book, if you haven't taken a look at it, I would suggest to read it if you're wanting a book that's focused on education or parenting. And what it goes through, and it's based in self-determination theory, which I'll talk about a little bit later. It's based on the idea that if you reward someone to do something, and then you take away that reward, they're not going to be as interested in doing that thing anymore. So what they've found is study after study that shows they took adults. They had adults who liked to do puzzles. They took some of them and they had them do puzzles for money. They took some of them and they had to do puzzles for fun. And then after the experiment was over, or ways after they put them in the same space with puzzles. The people who did puzzles for money did not return to those puzzles. The people who did puzzles for fun did. They found this pattern with kids. They took kids, they watched a bunch of preschoolers play with stuff. They picked out the ones that went to magic markers for fun. They identified them, they pulled them out. They took those kids, they said, okay, you're going to get money for every picture you draw with magic markers. They did this over several weeks. They returned the kids back to their natural habitat, let them choose whatever they wanted to play with. The kids who loved magic markers in the beginning, none of them went back to magic markers. They all used other stuff. And you see this pattern again and again, that when you use rewards, it diminishes people's desire to do stuff when the rewards are taken away, which is actually where this sentence comes from, which is great. This sentence is great for the gamification designer. Oh, as a gamification consultant, this is fantastic. You get to use my system forever. But for some of us, it's like, this is a problem. Another book I'll suggest, if you want to look at more of management styles or business perspective, I'll point you to Daniel Pink's Drive, based on the same theoretical framework. And what he looks at is how rewards actually diminish performance. And so what he finds, what he talks about in the book, is that if you have someone doing something for which there's no creativity, there's no intrinsic motivation, it's just a rote task, then rewards will make them do it faster. Not better, but faster. If, however, you have a task that involves creativity, that involves something that people have a desire to do, then rewards actually reduce the quality of the output that they create, because people focus on just doing what they have to do to get the reward. So there's a lot of danger when you drop these gamification systems into places where you want people to change their lives. So this got me concerned thinking about libraries. In fact, Alfie Kohn calls out library programs. These library summer reading programs that reward kids for reading lots of books. Reading lots of books and you get free pizza. Well, then you're going to have fat kids who don't want to read anymore. That's actually what he says in the book, you know. So the idea here is that if you have some motivation to read, and then you're given rewards to read, and then you take away those rewards actually undermine that intrinsic motivation. And if you look at libraries, so when I got involved with gaming in libraries, the main audience that library gaming programs focused on were teenagers, because teenagers were the group least likely to come to libraries. Because in many cases, these teenagers have just finished a summer reading program for years, which was supposed to motivate a love of reading, which was reward-based. In fact, there's some scholars, some of my colleagues are working on this study, trying to understand this and get some data behind it. And they found they went to a library that had added reward layers to all sorts of programs. They couldn't get kids to participate in their study without incentivizing the participation in the study. As compared to going to libraries that didn't have incentive-based programs, they got a lot of kids to engage with them in their study. So this made me a little concerned about gamification, you know. And if I think about games, you know, games is play plus goal and structure. Now, I have a degree in mathematics, so I have the ability to manipulate formulas. I was given that power with my degree, so I can actually subtract play from both sides of this equation. So games without play is goals and structure, which is reward-based gamification. That's what this is. That's what we've talked about, is we're just adding goals and structure to something in the real world. But wait. Games without play? That sounds pretty abysmal. And that's what we've got out there right now. That's what we're creating. There's a lot in games that aren't based on rewards. So my idea was to say, well, rather than just be a game scholar who stands up on top of a high bough and yells how horrible gamification is, let me make something better. Because I guess that's part of the librarian in me, you know, that I'm actually going to, rather than just, as they say, the best way to complain is to make something. So I said, all right, let me make an alternative. And let me embrace the word gamification. A lot of people who are working in alternate forms of gamification are saying, well, let's not use gamification. Let's call it gameful design. Let's call it this. Let's not use that word. But the problem is, and again, this is where the librarian in me comes out, there's this idea that if someone goes searching for gamification, then if you don't have an alternative, the only thing they're going to find is this reward-based gamification. There's a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, which is about how in the US, the Republican Party controls language by saying things like no child left behind instead of calling it no child goes ahead. Is actually the reality of it. But the idea here that by controlling language, by staying involved in the conversation, by using the word gamification, then it raises the chances that someone out there looking to start gamification might stumble across this and might say, oh, what's this? Meaningful gamification? Does that mean there's such a thing as meaningless gamification? Yes. But the idea here is behind meaningful gamification, the word of meaning is I'm trying to enable an individual person to find their own connection to the real world context. It's based out of the concept of relevance, of finding meaning. That the idea is that I want to help each one of you find your connection. And that's hard to do. That's a challenge. It's much easier to say, let me just give you free pizza. You know, pizzification is something we've used for a long time in colleges to get people to attend sessions. We want to try to avoid these external rewards that undermine intrinsic motivation, but instead use this layer, this playful or gameful layer we're creating to build intrinsic motivation. That's what we're trying to do. And I should say, I should stick this in now if I can put one lesson in your head. This is different from game-based learning. So game-based learning is where you are creating, you have learning outcomes and you're creating the self-contained system that people are engaging with. Like, where is Carmen Sandiego? That's game-based learning. You're not actually controlling Carmen Sandiego on the lookout for criminals. With gamification, it's a layer on top of something in the real world. And there's a lot of folks that are mixing those up, and it's important not to because there's different motivations going on and different thoughts about education. So we're really focusing on this idea of adding a layer. Now, I'm not going to go through my theoretical framework today. There's not time for that. This was actually where I started, though, by building theories. I took self-determination theory and an integration theory from DC and Ryan, which are these ideas. And this actually, if you want, this is the URL that has this theoretical framework. It will talk, so becauseplaymatters.com, pubs, if you look, there's a theoretical framework for meaningful gamification. So it brings together some motivation theories. It brings together some theories from library and information science, which help us understand that we don't have one solution for everyone, that you have to create choice for people. So if you think about a library space, when you go into that space, you've got lots of choices to explore, just like in a gamification system. That's how you can help people find what's relevant to them. You give them lots of choices. I look at universal design for learning, which helps us understand that different learners come to tasks with different ways of being able to learn and different ways of being able to demonstrate. And then looking at what's going on with player-generated content. But in order to put these theories together, I've operationalized it for you. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So again, if you want to dive into the theory, I'll point you to this, the full paper. It goes through how I melded all these together, because all of everything I'm talking about next comes out of this theoretical base. Now, I need to recognize that this stuff doesn't really matter as much when you're teaching a skill. If I want to teach you how to tie your shoes, I'm going to offer you a cookie to teach you the steps of tying your shoes. At the end of the day, you're not going to look down at your untied shoes and say, I'm not tying my shoes unless I get a cookie. Because the value of tying your shoes is better than the value of rewards. So that's trick one. If you're teaching a skill such that that value of what they're learning is more than the rewards they're getting, well then it's not so bad. It's okay. It's a way to actually get people to learn a skill. If you're doing something short term, we're talking about gamification of a conference. You're gamifying a conference. You're adding a game layer. It's 2 days. It's done. You're not trying to do anything long term. If someone doesn't have intrinsic motivation, then you're not going to harm it. So it's not as painful to use rewards, although you still have Pink's issue, that if you use rewards, you're going to end up creating people that do lower quality work. So you still have to think about that. But where I'm really focused is long-term changes. Where I'm really concerned is where I see systems like Zamzy. Zamzy is a system, it's a pedometer for kids. The idea is you give the kids the pedometer. The parents give Zamzy their credit card number. Haha, match made in heaven. And so the kids run around and exercise and accumulate points on Zamzy. They plug Zamzy back in. And then the parents' money buys rewards for the kids to have. So the kids then get to turn in their points they've earned by exercising for prizes. Well, all right, if we think about what we've seen from hundreds of studies, what's going to happen to any intrinsic motivation that the kid had after the reward system is no longer in play? After the parents are like, yeah, I'm not buying that anymore. It's going to be undermined. So this is where I'm concerned about gamification of healthcare. And again, when you're trying to change people's behavior in the long term, that's where this really matters. When I think about libraries, trying to bring about a love of reading, that's where this matters. So when you're thinking about this, the time where I'm really concerned about gamification is when you're trying to bring about some sort of long-term change. And that's where this is all built on. How do you make stuff that's going to help people change in the long term? We think about things like museums of play, museums of science. These are places that don't require badges. They don't require rewards. You don't have to be rewarded to go run around and play in a museum of science. There's actually a corporation that has figured out how to get people to pay almost $100 a day to go and learn about the world and science concepts. Tens of thousands of people flock every day to pay a lot of money to go and play in this space where they're actually learning. They don't need badges to do this. That's because they've created a space. And so one of the other pieces I've looked at is actually in this concept of ludic learning spaces. And there's another article at that website about using concepts from participatory museums to develop gamification systems using these elements of play. But again, I wanted to operationalize this for you. I wanted to operationalize how do you make this jump from focusing on rewards to focusing on meaningful gamification. And one good thing to remember, this is actually a spectrum. It's not an either-or thing. And so actually different people, something that you provide to them may come in. Someone that's, for example, really into storytelling and narrative may get into the ability to make a narrative as part of something that motivates them. And for them, a narrative activity is up here. But someone that can't stand the story at all, they're going to click through all the cutscenes in World of Warcraft because they just want to know how many rat pelts they have to collect. For them, the story is just in the way. So it's something to always think about, that whatever you do, it's going to depend upon the person, which makes this all really hard. I created a recipe to help you. So recipe, the letters in the word recipe, give you 6 things you can think about instead of using points to help create a system that's going to motivate people. And I'll talk about each one of these now. Reflection, exposition, choice, information, play, and engagement. You're not going to use all of these, but my goal was to really give you a mental checklist to say, okay, here I want to motivate people to do something. Can I use play? So play. This is another one of those terms that if I wanted to define, we would need an entire semester-long course to talk about the definition of play. But the important things we're going to talk about here is first that play is voluntary. You have to choose to play. Which is why when I listen to people talk about play-based assessment in schools, it makes my stomach churn. I'm like, wait, that doesn't work. Because immediately when you tell someone you have to play now, well, it's no longer play. It's something else at that point. So a key part of play is the choice, that you need to give people the choice. It's exploration within boundaries. You're going to create a boundaried system that you're going to allow someone to explore. And it's kind of like the Science Museum. If you think about that, it's a space where you can go and explore. There's that magic of going out and running around. And even if the kids are learning the same thing they would learn sitting in a class, they have that choice. And that's part of self-determination theory, is actually choice. People need to have that choice to play and explore. There's a lot of emphasis on maker spaces nowadays. And there's a lot of actually movement in the US in libraries to bring in maker spaces. And actually, maker spaces are just playgrounds for adults. If you think about it, it's the same kind of stuff. It's these big things you don't have at home, and you can go, and as kids, you know, you could get on these big slides and these big things, you climb up and down, and you make a narrative, and you make a story, and you're engaging with this stuff because it's fun. And maker spaces are doing the same thing. They've got these 3D printers, or lathes, or all this stuff you don't have at home, and you can create stuff. So it really is, the reason why these are so popular is because it is play. It's adults having a place to come and play. Another important part of play is about learning through failure. That play creates a mindset where you can fail. You can try and you can fail and you can learn from it. I've actually been employing a lot of these concepts in the classes I teach. So now in my classes I have the ability for students to redo assignments. So I give them a hard task, I allow them to try it, and then I allow them to redo it. And the way I operationalize that in the class is when you get an assignment back, you have 1 week that you can redo it, and I'll regrade it. You'll have another week to redo it. And as long as you'll keep working with me, we'll keep working. And when you've got the grade that you like, you can stop redoing it. And it's amazing, actually, it's the students that don't take me up on that. But I wanted to create a space where I can give you a really hard challenge, and I can say, you know, take this on and redo it until you've learned something, because that's kind of the goal of teaching, I think, is to help people actually learn things. So these play spaces, this is the National Museum of Play in Rochester. If you haven't been there, and you're driving across the thruway, and you're bored because you're driving across the thruway, check this museum out. It's one of the best museums of play in the US. What they've done, one thing they've done that's very clever is they've integrated a branch of the public library within the museum. So like you have the exhibit on Tolkien, and you have Tolkien stuff that you can play with for kids. There's an archive, so there's exhibits on the wall, so that at this one they have a napkin where Tolkien wrote out Hobbit's weights and measures during a dinner party where he was bored. So there's artifacts for adults to look at. And then there's books that you can check out, because there's a branch of the library. So the kids actually, at the moment of play, when they're inspired, when they're motivated, they can say, oh, I want to learn more about this thing. Okay, here's a book. I can take it home right now. It's a really cool concept of bringing together different places of informal learning, but taking advantage of that moment of desire, that moment of excitement. Choice. Now, choice is one of those key parts of self-determination theory, and it's the idea of giving people choices for stuff. To give people the ability to choose what they're going to engage with, to choose how they're scored. The idea of creating a gamification system instead of here's the one path you take. That you can make choices, that making the players co-designers of their gamification system. Some of the athletic systems are doing this. Some of the Nike Plus and Photocracy and things like that are giving players the choice to say, I'm going to do these things. I'm going to work on this stuff. You're just going to help me along the way. As compared to, you will do this to earn this badge. When you give the players choice and you just have a system that's helping them with their choices, it's much less likely to harm their intrinsic motivation because they made the choice to say, I want to do this thing. This is so at this conference, the Digital Media Learning Conference, one of the big popular words was pathways. I don't know if you've heard this term yet, but the idea of pathways is tied in with badges. So it's the idea of badging pathways. So the concept here is that in the non-harmful version, the users have all these choices of things they can pursue. And the pathways are things they've created themselves, which actually, it's funny, this reminds me of like the leveling up system from some of the Final Fantasy games and some other RPGs. If you've seen them, you have pathways where you choose, I'm going to build this skill, that unlocks these other places for me, and it gives the kids a way to make choices. So it says, okay, you want to explore programming. Okay, so here's a badge to start with, and then you're going to have 3 choices based upon the path you want to take. And each learner gets to sort of work on their own pathway, and you can see the pathways that other learners have created. That's the interesting way to do it. That empowers choice. However, if we flip over to the model of everyone needs to learn the same stuff so they can be tested on it, then these pathways just become a set of, here's the pathways that you will have to accomplish. So at the end, you will have a set of badges that will look just like everyone else who took the class, and you take away all the choice. So if you're going to use this stuff, the idea is to give the learner choices, and the pathways just help them make better choices as compared to dictating, here's the things you have to do. Information. So the idea of information is you want to provide your folks with the why they're earning certain types of points. I went on Weight Watchers. I lost about 50 pounds. I've kept it off. But when I was on Weight Watchers, what they did is they assigned points to food. You eat this thing, it's 5 points. You eat this thing, it's 10 points. You had so many points to spend in each day. Well, being a gamer, I said, well, how's this point thing work? Because they don't want you to know this. So I started playing with their little tools and hacking the system to figure out behind the scenes, how do points become food? And I learned, how's calories balance versus fiber versus fat? How does this all come into play? And that information allowed me to continue to make healthy food choices after leaving this system. I didn't have to think about the points anymore. Those are not important. It allowed me to look at two things and say, oh, okay, the fiber in this helps to balance out the fact that it's got a few more calories. I can make a better food choice. Giving your players information, helping them understand the why, ties into part of self-determination theory, which is mastery, that you want to help people to feel like they're mastering something, that giving them the understanding of why this happened. And this is a key difference between many digital games and many tabletop games. And I work on serious games. I teach a class on designing serious games. I have the students design tabletop games. And the reason why is because many times what you're trying to show with a game, with a serious game, is a process. And if that process is all automated by a computer and hidden from the player, they can't learn it. They're not going to pick that up. As compared to a tabletop game, which has to be human facilitated, and the process of facilitating that process in the game helps them understand what's going on, helps them see what's happening. So giving the people more information, and that allows an individual to pick out what's relevant to them. Hybrid cars are a good example. So for example, you drive a hybrid car, and this is from the Prius, from one of the Prii. When you're driving it, there's little lights that shoot out and show you, well, the energy is going from the wheels into the motor. You're pulling power from the battery now. You're not driving in an efficient way, and then you drive in a different way. You can see you're pulling power. So you learn as you drive when you're conserving power and what activities help you do that. As compared to some of the systems which show a tree. And as you drive, the tree's getting greener. Oh, the tree is dying. So while that's pretty, you're not learning what's actually going on. So giving the players the ability to understand the systems that they're working with, helping them. And if you think about the argument I'm making for making gamification systems, in order to help create your path in the system, you do then have to learn the whys. Not just here's your points, but here's why this stuff matters. And again, the goal of all of this is give the people enough touch points so they can find what's meaningful for them. That's what this is about, is giving people a spectrum of stuff they can explore to find how they can tie into that real world space. Exposition. I had to use exposition instead of narrative because otherwise it wouldn't have made the word recipe. But the idea of using storytelling, using narrative to create a metaphor. The narrative can be powerful. It can help people understand when they're delving deeper into the system, when they've mastered a part of the system and they're ready to move on. The narrative can be useful for that. It can also be a distraction, though. A badly selected narrative can draw people out of what it is they're trying to engage with and can get them focused in the narrative instead of focused in the real world.
I'm a tree.
That's right, I'm a tree. Yay, I'm driving like a tree. What? So the exposition can be useful for that. And here's how I've used it in classes. I allow my students to create the narrative for class. So the way they do it is everyone proposes a narrative, and then all the students vote on what narrative they want. So this was my gamification class. I had put them through all this awful point-based stuff, and then I said, okay, now you guys get to make the syllabus, make your narrative. And so this was the winning narrative, that the students were actually rats in a maze. They weren't actually in a class about that they were rats in my maze. And so I took on the role of evil Dr. Nicholson. This was an online class, so for the rest of the semester, I was speaking to them from inside a maze. I set up a little maze, I put the video camera down there, and I was reading everything like lab reports. So, and that's how I do it with this class. And when I return from spring break, my gamification class, what we're doing is they're going to be proposing their narratives. And I've said, I am your player in your play. You know, whatever role you want me to play, I will do. They actually also get to create all their assignments. They get to create how they're grading. They create everything. And I just push that forward because I'm giving them the power to set those structures for themselves. And since I've been doing this, it's interesting. Most classes, It's a multi-step process. So I make them do it on the first day, and I talk about how in the classroom, the syllabus is gamification. Teachers have been gamifying their classes for a long time. We're using these meaningless systems of points to motivate and manipulate our students to do stuff. We're really good at it. So I have them all I talk about how syllabus is gamification. They all make a syllabus for themselves. Then I show them how wonderful points and rewards are. I use stuff from marketing, and then I have them remake the syllabus so they load it full of achievements and badges and leaderboards and all this. Then we do it for a month. Then we move into looking at punished by rewards and Jane McGonigal stuff, and then I let them redesign their syllabus a third time. And each time, the syllabus is always turned into some kind of a learning contract space, some kind of a space where each student gets to sort of create their own adventure. One class, the students set it up so that their future selves who applied gamification became really incredible people. And the future selves are sending a series of tasks back to their past selves to help their past selves become the really awesome person that's in the future. And so each student got to create for them both in-class and out-of-class tasks. So some did I'm going to work out 3 times a week. And that was they got a grade for that. I let each student create their own structure. And then my job was sort of to balance it, to make sure it was fair between students, to make sure it made sense. But really, I didn't change it a lot. I let the students challenge themselves as much as they wanted to. So I'm excited because when I get to go back after spring break, which is happening right now, well, I'll see what the students have come up with. And I may have to buy a new wardrobe. Engagement. So another part of self-determination theory is relatedness, that we feel good about life, we feel positive about something when we feel connected to the world around us. So you can use gamification systems to help people connect to others. Because it can be that you don't feel motivation towards something, but one of your friends is really motivated, and by talking with them, you figure out, oh, that's why this is important, that's why this matters. Actually, in the library adventure ARG that you mentioned earlier, we tried to use this. So there's 2 things I did in that ARG. The first thing is that it looks, when you start playing it, it looks like a typical crappy educational game from the 1980s. And it's got badges and points and rewards. And then as you're playing it, you start to get messages, these IMs from the future saying, hey, what are you doing? You're giving the AI what he needs. Stop it. And you are embraced in this story that you've got to decide, do I continue trusting this AI who's offering me more badges? But this message from the future saying, hey, and you eventually get a newspaper article that says on this day, the day you're playing, a username with this username gave the AI what it needed for its turning points to begin taking over. So the player actually has to lie and answer questions wrong and not get points and rewards in order to win the game. And so it puts this player, it's actually, I don't think it's working very well because it's too heavy for a library game. But, that's why we grant money and experiment to see can we actually add a layer with meaningful choices and tough decisions. So that's part of what's going on here. But the whole thing is couched in when the librarian sets it up. Many of the ARG-type activities in libraries have been sort of scavenger hunts, go find random stuff. The librarian picks an issue that's important to that community or to people in that discipline. So for an example game we made around Shakespeare, about the role of Francis Bacon and what did he actually write? Did he write some of this stuff? You want to find a controversial issue. The players are asked to reflect upon that issue at the start of the game. How do you feel about this? They then go through it as they're doing their challenges. They're actually looking at library resources to help them understand the different sides of that controversial issue. At the end, they reflect upon it again, and they get to see how some of their classmates felt. So it's adding these levels of reflection, which is actually the next letter is reflection. But it's the idea of this engagement allows people to engage with each other. Rochester has this activity called Just Press Play. This is for their new game students, and what they're trying to do is to lower some of the barricades between students when they come, because they have their art students, and they have their programming students, they have their design students, and they want to get those students working together. So they made these different challenges that students took on that allow them to lower some of the normal barricades. A really cool one they did is that it's an award that everyone gets, so they get an achievement, everyone gets it if everyone, or I think it's 85%, pass the midterms. They had a very low passing rate of midterms. So they said, okay, everyone gets the achievement or no one gets the achievement. But you only get it if 85% pass. And the percentage of people that passed the midterms shot way up because now there was this reason people engaged with each other and continued to engage. Reflection is the final part of recipe. Reflection is where you reflect upon what you've been doing. Dewey said, who's an educational theorist, he said that if you do stuff but you don't reflect upon the stuff, you don't actually learn the stuff. Which you can tell if you watch a kid run around a science museum. You know, they run to here and push the buttons, and run to here and push the buttons. And unless there's some point where there's actually reflection that goes on, where you talk with them about what's actually going on, the learning doesn't connect. I've actually got an article at that same website that talks about the failure in many digital educational games to not have a reflection component, to have no point where you're actually getting the learner to reflect upon what they've been doing, that they just do but they don't reflect. And now in a classroom setting, the teacher provides that reflection. Or if you're playing a game with your friends, you can actually have those moments of reflection. But how do you create those times where, because reflection is actually, that's where the meaning connection can happen. That's where the idea of reflection is, think about your own background and think about something back there that connects to what's going on. And that's how you're going to be more likely to get people engaged in that context in a meaningful way. I participated in this game, Find the Future, which was run by Jane McGonigal at the New York Public Library. 500 of us all traveled to New York City. We were locked in the public library overnight, the NYPL. We came in at 8 p.m., we released at 6 a.m. We had one night to write a book. So the way it worked is that you went into the library, you had an app that sent you to something in the library, you looked at it, you took it in, you reflected upon it, and then when you got back, you were given a writing challenge that forced you to reflect upon the thing you just saw, but connect it to your life. Every writing challenge was about that, something from you that was inspired by what you saw. You got to pick what you went on, so they used choice. So the first thing I chose is a board game. And so it was a board game about travel from India, and talked about how board games in the 1800s were actually used as ways for people to show when they've gone somewhere. They create a board game to help you see the stuff they saw. So the challenge was write about something or make a game based on your own life and something you have seen that very few other people have done. So I'm reflecting, okay, what can I do? So I made a choose your own adventure game called The Quest for Tenure. And it was about, as you know, what the choices you had to make each year. You had to make choices about trying to head towards tenure. And at the end, you got to reflect upon if the person that you have become to get tenure is really worth all of this. Now that's sitting there in a book in the New York Public Library forever and ever, bound up with a bunch of other really poorly written stuff, because we'd write the stuff. It would go to an editor who would edit it a little bit. It'd go to a layout person. It would then be printed out, and a bookbinder bound it all into a book. And then we all signed the book at the end of the night. So that was all about reflection. It was all about giving you that situation to reflect upon what you've just seen and connect it to yourself. So this is my recipe: reflection, exposition, choice, information, play, and engagement. And sometimes you may need to use rewards for this, but I encourage you to think, if you can avoid them, to avoid them, because there's many other ways. And the reality is, this is actually just good teaching. You know, the reality is this is nothing new. But I've repackaged a set of things from games and inspired by play that aren't rewards, to help people perhaps to get away from focusing on these rewards. So I've been applying it. I've given you some of the stories from how I've done it in my classroom. I like to give my students choices. I actually have another article up there where I talk about all the things that failed, like the leaderboards that failed. I gave them these big point-based, reward-based systems. Those failed because what I found is the weaker students fell through the net. So if you want to learn more, take a look at that site. What I'm doing now, the next step, is this thing called the Gamification Journey, which is the idea that if you're going to start people as a newbie in a tutorial system with rewards, that's the appropriate place for them, because as Pink says, using rewards for some rote tasks can get the people through it quite quickly. So if you need to have rewards, you start it there, but you use them very sparingly. You then move them up into meaningful gamification. You help them find paths. But then the next part, where I'm going with my next piece on this, not today, but is on how to build communities of practice and affinity groups. And the goal of the gamification is actually to drop people off into a group. That group continues to exist after the gamification. And the goal of actually the gamification is to get rid of it, to make a gamification system that disappears, so that when they're done, they're left in a community of practice or community of interest or an affinity group where they can have a support group, they can have people to engage with, they're in a real world context, they're in the authentic space, rather than just being manipulated through rewards. So to learn more about any of this stuff, this URL, becauseplaymatters.com/pubs, there's 5 or 6 articles there, and this is where you'll continue to see stuff pop up as things go along. So with that, I see there's a few minutes left. If there are questions, we have a microphone to put into your hands. Are there questions?
Thank you, Scott. Before we turn to questions, I just want to say that your Gamification Journey project sounds fascinating. And I want to discourage you from doing any more of these talks so you can finish that so that we can actually make use of it. Questions?
So I'm just curious. You started with you were sort of experimenting with a leaderboard, and then you moved to there's another experiment you described where students are allowed to put in their allowed to redo the assignments until they get the grade that they want. I think it's a fantastic idea and very highly motivating. I am curious, however, how does that affect the motivation at the guys at the top who got it right the first time? Is there any effect at all, or are they, yeah?
What I've found is that high achieving students are going to continue to achieve no matter what system you give them. They're going to continue to succeed. With the redo things, it means, they bang it out once, they don't have to worry about it. So the stronger students are going to perform well. Where I found, and this is where I did my big experimentation, where I applied, there's a book called The Multiplayer Classroom, where you start everyone at level 0 with no points, and they get points, and they have lots of things to choose from. The higher level students did just fine. It's the weaker students who needed more support. They fell through the cracks. They failed because the system didn't give them enough support. So when I redeveloped all this, I thought, how do I create something where the strong students can still succeed, but those weaker students have the ability to be able to succeed and be able... Yeah, well, that's it. I gave them extra lives. I actually used a badging system the first time I did this, where they could get a gold badge, a silver badge, or no badge. And no badge meant that they had to redo it. Grade-wise, a gold badge was an A, a silver badge was a B. So the only grades in the class were actually A, B, F. But I didn't want to say ABF, because that was going to send a certain message to the students. So I said gold badge, silver badge, no badge, and you can redo them until you finally earn a badge. And the level of badge, this was for professional students in our library program, the level of badge was something that would be acceptable in the workplace. So once you did something that would be acceptable in the workplace, you earned a badge. It'd be a silver badge or a gold badge. You could redo it until you got gold badges on everything. And that's how I did that whole system.
Hey there, that was fantastic, blew my mind. I remember playing Final Fantasy X for the first time and coming to that area of the alternative leveling up. It was a lot of choice and almost too much, and I hated the game. So is there a way to structure that choice so that people become more engaged and not just throw out that overwhelming opportunity?
So if you're looking at like a school setting or a community setting, this would be a great place. In a school setting, it's a place where the teacher or peers get involved. In a hobby setting, that's a great place to start getting people engaged in these communities of practice. Because my idea with the gamification journey is that the further along they go, the more they get to see the role the community plays. So here, what they're going to see, and this is kind of like what Fold It does, that you get to see pathways that other people have already created. So you can see, and like in Final Fantasy, it'd be a lot easier if you could say, out of everyone that's played the game, here's the percentage of people that took different paths. So you get to know stuff. And then when you get in here, you actually begin to discuss those paths. Duolingo does a good job of this. Duolingo is a gamification system for learning a language. And for every question, there's a discussion board affiliated with it. So if you don't agree, if you got the wrong answer and you want to know why, there's a user-generated community talking about the nuances of that particular thing. So that's what needs to be there, is you need to have that community overlay to have people to turn to say, but it should be an overlay that you choose, a system, you choose to flip it on or not. Some people will be like, awesome, I can do whatever I want. You want to enable that. But other people, you want to say, hey, I want a little guidance. What do people who ended up doing this really cool thing, how'd they get there? And that's actually tying it way back. There's a concept called the scholar's workstation, which was the idea that in a library, what you would have is a scholar, as they look through microfiche and microforms, it would document the connection they made from article to article. And you could search articles, or you could search a scholar's searching path. And this was back from the 20s, 30s? I don't know. This is recorded, so I have to look it up. But it's funny how those ideas of the paths that others have had, it brings you into the community space.
Very informative talk, thank you. Wondering, like for these online services, not games, but like Stack Overflow or online forums, have like points and all, like the levels and like badges. Like if you have enough posts on the system, you have. That's clearly like a reward-based external. But how would they move to meaningful these types of like online services, the meaningful gamification and even no gamification?
So I'll use an example that I know well from Board Game Geek. So Board Game Geek is the largest board game website out there. It's all community contributed stuff. And when you get involved with the system, they give you rewards for doing things. You get Geek Gold. And so once you've earned 10 gold, you can turn that in and get a little picture by your name. And once you've earned 30, you could get a bigger picture. But then the rewards that you can actually turn those gold in for drop off. There's not nearly as much interesting stuff. So it's that early on, and so to get these rewards, you're engaging in different parts of the site. And their hope is that as you're doing this, you begin to see, oh, this is useful. Oh, I liked engaging in that. Because what happens now, I've got thousands of these things, and they're meaningless to me. It's just this pot that's collected into. And that's one suggestion on how to start out. If you feel you need a reward system, that you make it so that it helps you get onboarded, it helps you through those first few stages, but then the value of it drops off. And if you look at, they're starting to now look at patterns of use of typical reward-based gamification systems. And what you see is when you start with the rewards, there's this sharp initial interest, which is why this stuff is dangerous, because it works in the short term. There's this short interest, and then it's just a cliff of drop-off. And what you have to have at that cliff point, before they hit that, you've got to help them become finding their meaningful connections. So when you build the systems, you think, how do we make those rewards such that it's going to help people find what's meaningful to them? So when they hit that point where you've made the rewards now not worth much, that they've found other reasons to continue staying in the system.
These online, like how would you like say like having a space to create or generate something or choice? Like how would, once the points drop off, how would you create a space for generating something or creating something for them?
Well, so that's where, like in an online site, in a discussion forum, you've hopefully structured the rewards. And one way to do that is you make it kind of like some role-playing games do, that you can only get a limited number of rewards from exploring a specific area of the system. So if you want to get all the rewards, you have to visit, and that's actually an achievements concept. You have to visit all these different parts of the system. And the hope is that you've got enough places where users can be part of the community, that they've had a chance to find that connection that's meaningful. And the reality is, if by the time the user has seen all of the areas of your community, and if they've found nothing that's meaningful, and they're only posting for rewards, you really don't want them contributing.
Thanks, that was a very good talk. So one thing I didn't talk very much about, though, is the idea of flow, which seems like an important part of a gaming experience. And something that kind of maybe falls between the reward-based experience where you're getting feedback all the time, like points and badges and whatever that help keep you in that flow state, and also maybe some more meaningful, deeper experience. Anyway, I guess.
Yeah, and it's a choice of what do I have time to say. In the article that I wrote about participatory museums and play, I actually tap into flow quite a bit, the idea of how do museums make a flow experience. So what we're talking about, if you don't know, from Csikszentmihalyi, the idea is that the harder something gets, something should get harder as you get better at it. And you should stay in this state of flow, where you're feeling more and more confident, and then the challenge gets harder as you get better. And some gamification systems do that. And this is where the concept of using a narrative to help people understand they're moving into a deeper area is one way. Fold It does a good job of that. As Fold It, when you start playing with it, you're just doing some basic puzzles. And then as you get a little deeper in, you're making puzzles for other people. And then as you get deeper in, you're challenged with real-world research problems. And you're actually trying to tackle them by using the tools you've built up. So that concept of flow, of making the challenges harder. So the idea of having those level paths, the guidance, can be here's how to go on a series of things that's going to get harder and harder to keep you in that state of flow, to keep you balanced. And so that's a design principle that works really well, especially if you have a system that is amenable to making more complex challenges and using the system to help people understand when they're ready for it. And that's something that badges or rewards or something the idea is that you're creating these systems. There was actually a badge system that was really good at the conference I went to. And the system was for emergency responders. And the idea was that you can take on badges if you're interested in responding to an emergency. Before the emergency happens, you've had the ability to get badges based on what you can do. So it's not a reward. It's a certification thing. And then when you show up on the scene, they can just take your information, run the search against your badges, and know where to send you. They can also search in the local area for people that have gone into this badging system. That's great. And so I don't want to say all badges are awful. When it's used as a reward, as the goal, get the badge, that's the problem. But if it's used as a pathway, or used as a way of knowing when am I ready to go into the harder parts of the game, then that's okay. And so it's important with all these rewards to understand, is it an incentive or is it information? And using rewards as information can be fine, but using it as incentive is problematic.
So I also really thought this talk was great. One of the things I noticed, though, is that there is actually a lot of the world that is BLAP.
Oh, yeah.
You talked about tenure. I'm also pre-tenure.
Tenure, money, jobs, incentives, grades, it's
So-
what we live in.
One of my questions is, are BLAP games better for BLAP world? And I guess recipe games better for recipe world? Or is it actually that recipe games are better for both, or something?
You have to decide if you want to try to make a bigger difference. And that's where it's that longer term change is the real time to think about the recipe stuff. The BLAP stuff, we do a job because we get money. Many of the things we do, we get money to do the things, and we're used to that world. And if the money went away, the interest in the things would go away for many of us. But the idea of this is when you say, well, can we do better? We may have a BLAP world. We do have a world where many of you may be in this place right now because you're getting participation credit for a class you're in. That's why you're here. Can we do better? Can we create things that are more story-based, that are more meaningful? Can we inspire people? Can we create things? We were talking earlier about the theater. Can we create a theater space where people will be more engaged to go because they're learning more about what's going on? So I guess it's, can we do better? Yeah, you can incentivize someone with pizza or beer to do about anything, but can we actually help to make the world a better place? And that's, I guess, where I'm coming from with a lot of this is that's the easy way to do it, but it's not going to change things in the long term. So it's hard, and that's why I do the workshop where I let people blap something, and then I show them this, and they have them make a meaningful something, and the blapping something takes like 20 minutes, and the meaningful something takes hours and hours. And so it's a lot harder. But at the end, like my classes, having to grade, redo assignments takes a lot of time. But that would be time I would be putting in to make some sort of artificial badging system anyway. But it does take more time to regrade assignments. But at the end of the day, I look and say, those students now, they're empowered. They know something. They can do it. And they come out better at the end. So that's what I think it comes down to, is if it's important to you to try and make a difference, instead of just, do you want to manipulate people or do you want to motivate them?
I have one question, and then we can call it from that point. This has to do with a distinction. Well, the point you raised was that play is voluntary, right? I'm not entirely convinced that has to be the case, and so I'm wondering if, hopefully, your book project goes into that in a bit more detail, because there are certainly cases. The military training, for instance, where you can be playing inside a military simulator, jet simulator or something, but it's still not voluntary, if you will. So the other thing is, I do get concerned about the classic distinction between work and play, particularly as we work into gamification in the workplace and that sort of idea. So I don't know if you have anything you want to say about this point, but at this point, but I just, that's the one area where I thought, okay, you know what, I'm going to ask you about that.
Yeah, so this challenge of, and actually where I got to thinking about it was after giving a talk about this and having the director of the Museum of Play came up and said, Scott, have you thought about that if something is not optional, is it play? And this is actually, I'm thinking about this a lot, because if you try to argue why you can use this in the workplace, why you'd argue this in a military place, in a place where you're forced to do something, and that's part of that recipe concept, is not applying everything. And you just recognize that this thing that you're doing, we recognize it's not free play, because it isn't. There are some constraints, and if something is not free play, if there's something that can come from this act, something that come from the choice, kind of like game-based assessment. I'm very concerned about game-based summative assessment. So there's game-based formative assessment, where you play a game and you're learning about what you're weak in and you're learning about how to get better as you're playing and you're choosing the paths. But then at the end, we'll have a boss fight, and the boss fight will be the grade you get. Well, at that point, it's not a game anymore. You've stepped outside of that. Now it's an assessment. And I'm very concerned about the message that sends to kids when you say, oh no, you can play, but you can't lose because it's attached to this. And if part of play is that freedom to fail, then we've got some problems. So it can be playful, and activities can be playful, but thinking about making that distinction between, here's the place where you're learning, now you are being assessed, being honest about that. I'm really worried about when I see they call it stealth assessment, where they have you play a game and we're actually assessing you, but it's fun. That really bothers me, because that's getting away from the trust that you say of giving you a space. Because sometimes I'm actually designing sort of a board game now that will never be a big hit, but forcing players to choose between fun and winning. And do you choose to, by winning, you make the game a very unpleasant experience for yourself. And thinking about this play versus win dichotomy.
Thank you. I really liked your talk. So about the thing that you were talking about just now. So if a person is allowed to fail and you're not assessing them, that's a good environment to learn. That's all right. But what if the person has some sort of external addiction? For example, the person is addicted to movies, or let's say the internet nowadays, right? The person may not be motivated as much to, be enthusiastic about the system that you are building. Then how exactly are you going to motivate a person like that to give up other things which are less meaningful and engage in things that are better for life, let's say?
So in a situation like that, and if I'll use again what I'd do if I were in a library space, because a lot of goals as a librarian is helping people to make connections from who they are to stuff that's in the library, and you do this by finding out more about them. So in this case, if you knew you had users that really liked movies, you would actually try to use that. Because part of reflection is saying, here's this thing I want you to look at, think about yourself and where is their connection. So in this case, it might be make a film about this thing. Tap their thing they're passionate about. And that's going to make them more likely to make those connections. But you can't do that with a single pathway of game-like elements and rewards and badges. You have to create that system where people have the ability to find others who are like them, to find an affinity group of people who are losing weight and like movies. And they're going to find some connections. Hey, why don't we all come together and we'll all bring our treadmills and watch a movie together while we're treadmilling? I don't know. But the idea of trying to make those opportunities for those connections to be done, either by the system making them, by connecting people into a community of people like them, so they get to find out those connections, or making a system that people can mod into something that ties into their own passions. And that's what you, but that's just good teaching too. As a good teacher, you're always seeking for what can I do to inspire each student to be involved. I teach a public speaking class, and for that class, I let the students make their own narrative for themselves as defining the organization they're going to represent all semester. And they're going to do everything in line with that organization. So whether that be a video game company or a sports company, finding that other thing they really like and tying this into it is a way to keep that engagement going.
Thank you very, very much for this. One thing I will say is that the Games Institute has a strong interest in gamification, and we have projects going on right now that involve people who are engaged in gamification in various ways. If you have some ideas, some thoughts, some ideas for projects, something you want to pursue, please get in touch with me or Agata. You can get our email addresses from the Games Institute website. And the other thing I will say is that, like Scott, I actually like the word. So I like the word. I like the derivation of the word. I just like what the word does. So if you don't like it, come up with your substitutes, and we'll include those too, but don't get rid of my word, okay? It's a really good one. So thank you so much. This was great, and you've given us a lot to think about.